The fourth and final season of Infinity was a challenge to make. This video is going to be a little bit longer than usual, partly because season 4 was so vast in scope and scale, and also because I have a lot to say on exactly why it took so long to make, and why I'll likely never do anything like it ever again. The whole idea of season 4 is that it's the season where everyone comes together to defeat the ultimate evil, and then everything gets tied up neatly in a little ribbon to round off Infinity as a series. This is what I'd been building up to for just under 2 years, so I had given it a good deal of thought. The first thing I really had to work out is what each character's arc would be, what would happen to them in the end, essentially. I worked out pretty quickly that I wanted the twins to die in a grim and depressing twist. The Outrider would live, but she'd be forced by the Ahamkara to shoot and kill Ryan. These were the earliest plot strands I had worked out because they were by far the cruelest and darkest in the whole series, and that kind of sadism towards my own characters is quite easily remembered. Next, Ariana had to survive. I really wanted a happy ending for Ariana because I felt like after everything that she'd been through, she deserved it. It seemed fitting that my very first project started with Ariana, and so my very last Destiny project would finish with her as well. I should point out, for reasons I'll get to later on, that I considered Season 4 of Infinity to be the last Machinima project I would ever make while I was making it, so I was working under the assumption that this would truly be the end. Anyways, on to the rest of the characters. I kind of needed Osiris to die because I needed him to complete his character arc by actually sacrificing himself to save everyone and doing the heroic thing like Saint 14 did. I always thought it would be awesome for Toland and Shinobu to have a sword fight, so this entailed Toland dying as well, since thematically Shinobu should win because she's the good guy and also she's learned from when Toland gave her the sword. Shinobu herself was going to retire, and I had her closing monologue formed pretty early on because I wrote it to mirror my own sense of stepping back from Machinima after season 4, to reflect my sense of being exhausted and wanting a quieter and less busy life. Deacon was going to die to sacrifice himself for Tyler. I decided early on not to really include Fawcett in season 4, mostly because there were already 1,000,001,001 characters and I didn't really know what to do with her. I felt like her story was essentially complete as of season 3, and I don't think adding her in would have contributed any real depth to the narrative. Marcus Wren had to die in another cruel death, being possessed by the main villains on Verslinder. Wolfenstone and or the Nine had to be taken out pretty early on just to tie up that last loose thread, and also to kill off the Nine quickly because they're the most powerful agent in the series after Verslinder, and so I needed to avoid a climactic confrontation that involved them. Kairos, Hector and Iris were going to survive, but under exactly what circumstances were unclear. With these character arcs in place, things started to piece themselves together as I was writing the plot synopsis for season 4. Elliot and Pahanin were unceremoniously killed off in single sentences, mostly just to get rid of them, quite frankly. Pahanin in particular was a throwaway death because I really just didn't need the character anymore. Fields was almost killed in a similar manner, but I decided to save him because in the end I felt like it would have been one casual and cruel death too many. Kane needed to die, and I had intended for him to die trying to save Iris, but the way that the plot worked out left his death somewhat anticlimactic, and it's one of the few elements of season 4 that I'm still majorly disappointed in myself with. Finally, Brandy needed to survive because of her and Hector's romance subplot, and the Outrider would survive, but would survive broken, free of the Ahamkara's influence, but mourning the loss of her son. I worked backwards from these endings, moving characters around in my head like they were chess pieces, trying to shift them into the correct locations and situations. The fact that I had a centralised team made things easier. I talked in the video for season 3 about the idea of having a team where all the good guys hang out and talk about stuff, and I returned to this format in season 4 because it's a really good way of juggling a lot of generically heroic characters who are all united against a common foe. The characters who fall outside of the team, the Outrider, Riley, and Tobin, are all geographically isolated in locations they aren't generally seen outside of for the most part. Talking of Tobin, he was added in as a fun subplot, a serial killer who hunts guardians, and I based him semi-heavily off of John Doe from Seven. It was a kernel of an idea that I had for season 4, back when Infinity was supposed to be 5 seasons, with the 4th season kind of being a dark, noirish crime drama sort of affair. That concept ultimately ended up being scrapped when I moved Infinity from 5 seasons to 4 seasons, but elements of this idea made their way into Tobin's character, which is a sort of deranged, cultist type mentality. The final aspect of the plot that I want to discuss is the villain, Zon Verslinder. Verslinder was a villain teased at in seasons 1 and 2 and acts as the very obvious big bad of the entire Infinity series. However, I'm not particularly happy with him, mostly because Verslinder suffers from the Marvel villain problem. He wants to destroy the world, which is a generic and uninteresting end goal. He's powerful and ancient and evil, but he speaks only in menacing cliches, and he's got very little proper personality because he treats every character the exact same, and this makes him very predictable. He's less of a character and more of a force of nature, a catalyst for the heroes to unite rather than any sort of personality in and of himself. With all of my plot elements in place then, it was time to write my script. The script for Season 3 of Infinity was written evenly and easily over a long period of time with a lot of thought and care with regard to the plot and dialogue. The script for Season 4, on the other hand, was the exact opposite. For the first time, I'd failed to prepare my script ahead of time. When episode 8 of Season 3 was uploaded in December of 2020, I'd only written up to episode 5 of the Season 4 script. I took a little bit of a break for Christmas because I'd worked quite hard, but when January kicked in I got straight back to writing. I was keen to get started on the production of Season 4 as soon as possible, so I was in a bit of a rush to finish the script. This meant that I wrote at a ridiculous pace. I blitzed through the remainder of the script in the span of about a week, writing 2,000 or 3,000 words a day, every day for a week. Writing this fast meant that I was essentially writing on autopilot, typing quickly without even thinking about what I was doing. This is quite a high level skill and it takes a lot of experience with writing to be able to pull off, but nobody writes at their best when they're writing that fast. This meant that the script for Season 4 suffered a little. The fact that it's even broadly coherent is impressive considering how fast I wrote it, although I did obviously go back and do a quick review of it to check for any glaring mistakes. But the key factor that defines the script for Season 4 is the scale of the project. I was juggling so many characters and in so many locations with so many plot threads that I occasionally lapsed into formula. Each character does get their own little moment to shine though, and I don't think there's many characters that don't develop in some meaningful way, apart from Elliot, who's killed off early, and Panine, who's killed off late. But the way that the team is neatly split up and sequestered throughout most of Season 4 felt artificial to me. In a certain sense though, it was definitely necessary. I had far too many characters for them all to be together at the same time. So I needed an excuse to break them off into smaller sub-teams that I could cut between to sustain dramatic tension. Another aspect of the script that I felt could be improved was the dialogue. Because I wrote so fast, the dialogue was relatively unpolished, and the plot mechanics of Season 4 are quite cumbersome anyway, so there's a lot of lines that need to be in the script just to manoeuvre characters into certain situations. The dialogue in Season 4 doesn't feel like it has quite the same wit or spark or charm of Season 3, although in some of the one-on-one discussions it certainly does come close. Toland and Kairos' conversation, for example, was one that I had a lot of fun writing because it's taking the two smartest people in any given room and it's pitting them against each other. Similarly, Osiris' simulation vision things in the final episode were also really exciting to write because I got to go back and bring in material from my Destiny 1 Machinima. I purposefully wrote the scene with Saint 14 to be a little bit more gentle and softer than in Phoenix Rising, and Osiris's line that he always cared was enough to rectify the lack of affection between the two in Phoenix. Generally speaking, my best work, in writing anyways, is back and forth conversations between two characters, which is why the Outrider and the Ahamkara's dialogue snaps and crackles with real sort of vigour, whereas Eriana's team leader speeches feel a little bit contrived. Again, my weaknesses with writing are comedy and romance, which Panin and the whole Hector Brandy pairing both definitely show up. But overall, I am still quite proud of the script for Season 4, because I can nitpick little lines here and there forever, but at the end of the day, the script did everything I needed it to. It carried the plot through, developed the characters, and it is actually a pretty substantial piece of writing. I wanted to make sure that I had every character covered, really, which is why the script was so long. A lot of the scenes are just one-on-one discussion scenes, but they need to be there because they give credence to every single little character. And with the script completed in late January of 2021, I could then begin my shoot. The shoot for Season 4 of Infinity was long, and I will talk about the more psychological aspects of the shoot later on. But for now, let's quickly cover the technical details. Most of the season was shot in a 3-month spree during February, March and April of 2021. I had the entire season shot by mid-August 2021, so the shoot actually didn't take me that long. The difference compared to Season 3 was obviously that there was just a hell of a lot more footage to film. A substantial bulk of that actually was made up of solo scenes, with the Outrider Ahamkara portions being especially easy to shoot, because I only had to worry about manipulating 2 controllers instead of 3. For context, I was still using my 3 Xbox setup for the most part, although there are certain scenes which required additional help. The way I directed and communicated with body actors in Season 4 was quite poor. I was disorganised, relatively uncommunicative, and I didn't schedule body acting sessions, really. Instead, I just opted to try and nab anyone who was on when I had an hour or 2 to spare. I'll explain why I was like this later, but it wasn't a great feeling as a director to be so off balance. It made filming with other people stressful, although I tried my best not to let it get to me. Most of the scenes, however, were shot with just myself and all 3 of my Xbox controllers, and the schedule remains much the same from Seasons 2 and 3 of Infinity. Specifically, I would wake up at 8 or 9 in the morning, and then film until 1 or 2 PM in the afternoon, sometimes even later if I was in the right mood. I did this most days during February, March and April. The COVID lockdowns hadn't quite abated at that point, which meant I had swathes of free time in my hands for those months, and I definitely made the most of it. Even though most of the scenes weren't difficult per se to actually film, compared to my previous work, I actually had a lot of setup to do for some of the shots. Anything in the throne world, so anything in Verslinder's dimension, was shot in the Shattered Throne, so all the scenes, especially in the orb walkway room, required me to solo the first part of the dungeon, which was an enormous pain, especially as I'd never actually done it before. For the Verslinder versus the 9 Wolvenstone fight, I saved a checkpoint by changing characters during an LFG run of Prophecy, so that at least wasn't too bad, although the fact that Bungie had removed the Unknown Space Crucible maps by that point was severely annoying. That being said, in terms of locations, it was actually Io that gave me the most trouble. By this point, the Isle Patrol had been removed from the game, again curse Bungie and their Destiny content vault, so the only destination on Io was Javelin 4, the Crucible map. The problem was that I'd already used most of the distinct areas in Javelin during Season 1, and Javelin 4 is not a large Crucible map, to put it mildly. I scripted Season 4 to be on Io, and I really wanted it to be on Io because that's the location that felt most like home to me, but the limited space I was working with meant that a lot of the scenes where one good guy is talking to another tend to feel pretty samey because of the background environment, which is constantly being reused because there's so little of it. That being said, I do feel like I did as good a job as I could have in switching up the locations as much as possible, bringing every last corner of Javelin 4 into at least one discussion scene. Most of the scenes on Javelin were just discussions anyways, which are never usually difficult to film. Some of the combat sequences elsewhere, however, particularly Roderick's death and the beginning of Kane's jail breakout, were very fiddly to film because they're very bitty scenes. The cuts happen quite quickly, so there were a lot of swapping characters and switching camera angles involved, which is doubly irritating when you consider how slowly a standard Xbox One is at loading Destiny 2. Finally, Ryan's death was unique in that there's no actual machinima footage for that scene. You can't really get children or adolescents or teenagers or anyone who isn't an adult in Destiny, and the whole point of Ryan's character is that he's a kid who's vulnerable and can't defend himself, so depicting his actual death would be impossible. I had the Ahamkara blind the Outrider in the script to kind of force a situation where I could go a little bit more abstract and rely on the audio to carry the story, which I feel like was definitely a smart choice. It's a lot creepier, actually, if you can't really see what's going on, especially with the colour-changing trippy visuals. It makes Ryan's death feel less gratuitous, not that it's particularly gratuitous anyways, but it makes it feel marginally more tactful, I think, and less grotesque. In the previous section, I mentioned being displeased about my abilities as a director whilst working with other people, and I also mentioned I'd explain why that was later on. Here's the thing, to understand the conditions in which Season 4 was produced, you have to understand how things evolved for me during the course of 2021. Like I said, the first 3 months of the shoot, February, March, April, was when most of the footage was shot, and although it was tiresome work, I had a pretty stable routine and I was very, very productive. From May to August, several things happened to hamper my progress in Machinima. Firstly, I took up a warehouse job packaging COVID tests, which I started at the beginning of May. At first, the hours were predictable and reasonable, however, people kept ordering COVID tests and so the shifts got longer and longer. By mid-August, I was doing 12 or 13 hour shifts, and my final 4-day run of shifts ended up clocking in at 53.5 hours, which is absolutely insane. It was not a fun experience, and on my final shift I was physically ill with sleep deprivation to the point where I was swimming in and out of consciousness. And all the while, I was living very much not on my own, and I was starting to find it suffocatingly difficult to coexist in a household with other people. I'm saying all this not to garner sympathy. I should make that very clear, because things are a lot better now. In September, I quit my job and moved into a flat on my own, which sort of kickstarted my mental and physical recovery, but rather I'm saying all this here and now to illustrate how difficult a time those few months were for me, because it's important in understanding my moods and attitudes towards the machinima that I was making. I struggled to eat substantial meals on the 4-day shift patterns when I was working, never mind do any productive work in Machinima, and even on my designated 4 days off I was often too tired to properly marathon the work like I was doing at the start of the year. Again, I don't want to be over dramatic because this kind of awfulness only lasted a couple of months and I did recover from it a long time ago, but I can't really talk about Season 4 of Infinity without talking about all that dark stuff, because to me, that is my overriding memory of making Season 4. It's most of the reason I was so slow in getting the season out, and it's why I don't ever want to attempt anything on that scale again. That being said, the work I did on Season 4 during the summer of 2021 did keep me busy, which I definitely needed at that point. I was doing everything, shooting, scripting, editing on absolute autopilot with no thought behind what I was doing and certainly no passion or drive or creative spark. I was falling back on techniques that I knew inside out from having produced the previous 2 seasons of Infinity with them. I was using my machinima work to numb myself and to distract myself from what was going on in the world outside of Destiny, and it was comforting in some small way. But it didn't always work like that, and there were times when shooting or editing or doing any sort of work on Infinity seemed tantamount to self-torture. I shot and edited it all anyways because more than anything I wanted the project finished, but I wasn't always happy when I was working this way, and I feel like it would be disingenuous to do a video like this without mentioning that fact. The casting of Season 4 turned out to be pretty unremarkable, all things considered. Almost all of the cast from previous seasons ended up reprising their roles, which was fantastic news and made everything a lot simpler and easier in my end. Again, the only lines I had recorded live were Hector's lines with Finchie, which were similarly a hassle to process in Reaper, but ultimately weren't quite as bad as Season 2, because although Season 4 is longer, Hector isn't quite as prominent in it. I haven't really mentioned this previously, but the robotic effect on Ariana's voice was added by me, using Audacity's reverb effects. I resorted to voicing Zon Verslinder, the main villain, myself, because I knew in advance that I was going to be processing his lines so heavily that it didn't really matter the tone of voice that the actor had or who was speaking them. In order to make my voice sound like Verslinder's, I recorded all the lines as normal, then I pitch shifted them down, reversed them, slowed them down significantly, and then stretched them back to speed them up a little bit. The end result is that my voice is much deeper, much slower, and reversed obviously, so I might as well be spouting garbage. The stretching also lends a slightly distorted, almost underwater-esque quality to the whole thing, which just ups the creepy, imposing villain factor. I did make the deliberate choice to have Verslinder speak his own alien language to add to his fear factor, but subtitled for ease of understanding. For the few characters who speak Verslinder's language at certain points, namely Toland the Ahamkara and Kairos, I just reversed their lines with no other changes, since I wanted to keep the timbre of their voices very much intact. The editing was essentially the same as Seasons 2 and 3, just with a few extra complexities thrown in. For starters, the striking visual overlays that I used for the flashbacks in Season 2 returned for Predith's transmission. But the most complicated bit of editing was Ryan's death. It's made up of several layers of Windows Media Player visualizations that I screen recorded, with another visualization being used to generate the waveform pattern that goes over the whole thing. I was pretty pleased with how the whole effects turned out in the end, and it definitely felt like a new and exciting experience, not having to rely on Machinima footage and instead taking on more of a sort of audio drama type format. Because of the way I'd marathoned filming during the spring and the summer, September to December of 2021 was spent mostly just editing, voice lines and video, although at that point I had a lot of other stuff in my plate outside of Machinima to juggle as well. I got the last set of voice lines in on December the 1st, but it wasn't until the 9th that I actually edited them down. At this point I was extremely annoyed at how long it had taken me to make Infinity, and I was desperate to finish the project. So what I did was I started editing at about 10:30 at night on December the 9th, adding music to and rendering episode 9, and I didn't stop working until the final episode had been uploaded. The final episode was rendered at 6:30 in the morning. This meant that I had edited for 8 hours straight, which was pretty impressive. The final episode was uploaded at 1:30 in the afternoon, which meant that on the whole I had been working for about 14 hours, which was absolutely crazy. The buzz of being so close to the end kept me going throughout the night, which, although it made me fast, also made me a little bit sloppy. There are a few editing glitches in the final few episodes that I'm pretty sure I missed just because I was rushing. The relief of knowing that episode 12 was uploading and that I was actually done was immense. I was so hopped up in adrenaline and caffeine that I actually couldn't sleep, not even after going out for a run after the episode was rendered and while it was uploading. That being said, because I had work in the evening, I did, after episode 12 was uploaded and after Infinity was finally and eventually completed, I did manage to fall asleep. Season 4 of Infinity was a monumental undertaking. In terms of plot and narrative, I felt it was a bit of a regression from Season 3, but the sheer scale of the thing necessitated a more tightly structured storyline, which I felt I could have executed about as well as I could have. The thematics are a little less interesting, and it's a little bit more linear than Season 3, but on the whole, bringing the character arcs to their conclusions were immensely satisfying. In particular, the Outrider, Riley, Ariana, and Shinobu were all incredibly cathartic to write and render, at least in comparison to characters like Iris, Elliot, Fields, and Panine, who were much more of a side thought. Although I do still have issues with Season 4, in particular with regards to the script, I'm ultimately quite proud of it, and by extension of Infinity overall. I'm especially proud of how I kept going with Infinity even when I became dispirited and disillusioned, which became a much more frequent and overpowering feeling as the production wore on. Looking forward to the future, I do have rough plans for some new Machinima, although the form that'll take is very much subject to change. My relationship with Machinima as an art form has grown more complex and ambivalent as of late. I've got less free time to devote to making the stuff, and I've become more interested in other creative endeavours, a live-action short film that I'm currently working on being one of them. But even so, I think there's still something special in Infinity, and looking back on what I've done, I'm struck not just by the epic size of the story or the length of time it took me to tell, but all the people that were a part of that journey too, all the voice actors and body actors and friends and strangers who all contributed to the series in large and small ways. I've talked a lot about the work that I put into Infinity, but on my last note here I want to thank everyone who contributed in any way to the show. Some of the people who helped out at the start have since drifted away, and some of the people who have stayed are already aware of how much they've helped, but I feel like it's worthwhile saying it at the end all the same. Infinity might be my show, but it would never have been made without the dozens of people who helped. And whatever projects lie in the future for me, that won't ever change.